Today, I have the distinct pleasure of speaking with Dr. Alex Moyes from USA Rare Earth. Alex, where do we start? How about Serra Verde?
Yeah, that has certainly been the biggest splash in the news lately. So Sarah Verde, and we've talked a lot about it publicly. Sarah Verde's been on the radar for a number of years. Not they've done a good job of being on the radar, but not being out in front for good reason because they have such a valuable asset and they've had their heads down. They've put together an amazing team, an amazing operation, which I've been, super lucky to go and visit, a couple of times now in the course of this transaction. And it's world class. And, as Barbara, our CEO, has talked at length about and Thras, the CEO of the Serra Verde Group, it's really a strategic asset, not just for USA Rare Earth, but certainly for the Western world. It's the only mine outside of Asia right now that is actively producing, all the magnetics, NdPr, Dy, NTB. It's very enriched in the heavies, which is typically where the heavy rare earth elements come from these ionic adsorption clay deposits, but they have an exceptional balance of them. And they plan on getting up to 6,400 tons of trio in their phase one, by the end of 2027. So it's a huge source that the world desperately needs, and we've got so many big plans with them. So we're grateful to be working through the closing process with them right now.
I don't think I've ever seen so much buzz about anything happening in the rare earth industry in years. It's my understanding that this acquisition could represent 50% of non-China heavy rare earth supply by 2027. That's like tomorrow in rare
Yeah.
earth time, yeah,
Yeah.
in the rare earth time scale. And of course, you have the core four. But what's intriguing about Serra Verde, for those of you out there who may not realize this, is that they're already producing three of those. They're producing the dysprosium, terbium, and yttrium already. So this is a geopolitical repositioning of critical mineral supply worldwide. So congratulations.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Trey. For sure excited. I mean, there's so many synergies. While they might be in Brazil and we're here in the US, again, I can't say enough about the expertise they've built down there. So, whether it comes to Round Top or some of our other initiatives, we're going to be able to share some really excellent ideas and really lift each other up and build each other's very critical operations together.
Speaking of speed to increasing valuation, of course, of USA Rare Earth in record time, you're also building the midstream and the deal with Carrister.
Yeah.
Can you give us a bit of an update on that one?
Sure. Yeah, Carrister, again, we view Carrister in the same light as we view Serra Verde. Carrister is got an excellent reputation. They're one of the world leaders in separations, one of the world leaders in solvent extraction. And so we've been really fortunate to be engaging with them. And of course, we've announced our LOI for a strategic investment in the company. And we view that strategic investment, for a couple of reasons that it's going to produce excellent results for the broader ecosystem. One, we get access to their expertise. While we have significant expertise here in the US, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later, they also have different perspectives and excellent scientists and engineers working for them. Two, they're commissioning their Caramag facility over in France, and that's moving quicker. They're ahead of us in the US on our separations. So we've got a lot of opportunities to build an ecosystem and start separating products, sooner than if we weren't involved with Carrister. But I think more importantly, we've got to think about the rare earth ecosystem, on a global basis, right? Certainly a non-China basis. And France is really starting to establish itself as a hub of where they actively want to support and build out this part of the supply chain. So we also announced that in addition to our ongoing work through our strategic investment in Carrister, we're also expanding less common metals into France as well. So the synergies between those two companies are incredible. They have a long history, a long relationship. And so to have them nearby is going to be a huge advantage to USA Rare Earth and the broader ecosystem in the rare earth element space. So we're very excited to keep moving that forward.
Well, speaking of exciting, you're going to be a speaker at the upcoming CMI Summit 5. Do you know what you're going to be talking about? Because you just
Yes.
have so many options.
Well, I will for sure be putting in a plug for Sarah Verde because I know that's what everyone wants to hear about is one of the biggest announcements I think in upstream acquisition for rare earth elements. So I'll certainly mention that, but I'll spend the bulk of my time really talking about what's really, I would say, my biggest passion right now is Round Top. And and there's been a lot of interesting opinions on Round Top for years. And so I'm going to spend quite a bit of time walking through the evolution of Round Top, its history. Its history goes back, well into the 80s. It was originally prospected for a beryllium mine. There's a great beryllium resource right at the bottom of the mountain. They've put in a test underground mine there back in the 80s. And then through there, there's just been decades of drilling, again, starting in 2011, 12, massive drilling campaigns. So there's so much that's been learned about the mountain. We're building off of a huge data set. We're building off a ton of history. And and there's beyond the rare earth elements, there's a number of other elements in Round Top. And I'm going to spend some time, talking at the summit about why it's easy to get excited. It's kind of like, a kid in a candy shop. We've got lithium, we've got the heavies, we've got lights, we've got niobium, we've got beryllium, and we want to produce all of this for everybody. And I think that's largely been one of the challenges of Round Top and why it didn't take off because when you're trying to recover every possible element from a polymetallic deposit, there's a number of challenges. And so we've taken a very fresh look. We've really narrowed what we're trying to accomplish, and that is to be the best heavy rare earth element producer in the United States with the Round Top deposit. So that's our exclusive focus is the heavy rare earth elements. Again, Round Top is globally unique. I don't know of any other deposit that has a 72% average heavies distribution. It is low grade, averaging 650 parts per million. We get a lot of incoming, I would say, questioning about the grade. But what I'll walk through at the summit is when you start comparing the grade, 650 parts per million, 72% heavies distribution, with a very solid recovery in our heap leaching, approximately 70% we've demonstrated, you end up getting a very, very high cut of heavies. And then when you compare that to, say, average ionic clay deposits, which are the dominant source, in Asia, Southeast Asia for the heavies, they average, say, 1,500 parts per million. That sounds like a lot better grade, right? But they only have a 25 to 30% distribution of heavies typically typically lower recoveries, 50% on the desorption process. So when you put all of this together, Round Top, when you compare it to these average heavy, clay deposits, we're 2 to 3, in some cases 4 times higher the effective recovery of heavy rare earth elements with a very simplified flow sheet that's heap leaching straight into solvent extraction. So I know that's a lot of detail, and I'll be really excited to talk more about that at the CMI Summit. And that's just a glimpse of why we're so excited about what we're accomplishing at Round Top right now.
Now, this is an audience that will absolutely eat those details alive. So now I'm just going to ask you a couple questions because I'm trying to determine which panel you will be best on. So
Sure.
let me start with this one. We have a potential panel called Midstream is the Battlefield. And of course, I think USA Rare Earth understands this. Any
Yeah.
comments on this?
Oh yeah. Yeah, the midstream or to be specific, kind of the separations, how do you take these concentrates that many of the upstream mines are producing, which are incredibly important and such a key piece of the supply chain, but how do you take these concentrates or MRECs, these mixed rare earth element carbonates, and separate them into the individual rare earths that we need to then move into metallization. And that is a huge focus of what we're doing at USA Rare Earth and in our upstream business unit. So we are tackling really on three different fronts the midstream or the separations portion. One at Round Top, not only will we be mining it, as I mentioned, after heap leaching, we go right into separations exclusively for heavy rare earth elements. So we're talking dysprosium, terbium, gadolinium, and then we'll also have a mixed heavies carbonate that we plan to produce, which will have lutetium, europium, ytterbium, and holmium, all very important. Lots of demand for those right now. We get so much inbound, but most importantly, I would say the oxide that has surprised me most, where I get the most calls, is on do you have yttrium? And it turns out that we have a massive supply of yttrium. So we will also be separating yttrium there at Round Top. So huge focus. We're working with some of the best in the world with Fluor, WSP, and then of course internally we have some of the best separation scientists and engineers working for us at USA Rare Earth. So that's one piece of the midstream. But I also want to bring up that we've announced that we're also doing separations for third-party MREC. So we're in the process of putting together a separations facility, a joint separations facility, because not only will we be separating MREC from third party, but we're also going to be hosting in that same facility our swarf recycling. So when we make our magnets at our magnet manufacturing facility in Stillwater, you end up generating, a fairly decent amount, 20, 25% as you're shaping these various blocks, these various magnet forms. You get what's called swarf or the magnet scrap, if you will. And so we've developed internally a recycling process for that. So we can take all of that swarf and we can turn it back into its separated oxides, NdPr, DYTB, get that back into the supply chain, through our subsidiary, Less Common Metals, and move it back into the magnet. So we are full steam ahead on three fronts: third-party separation of MREC, swarf recycling, and then of course our heavy separations facility that'll be co-located down at the Round Top deposit. So huge focus for us right now.
Fantastic. Well, that's an absolute guarantee that you're going to be on that panel. However, I have to bring up the panel on how government capital is now shaping commodity markets
Yeah.
because you have been almost the chosen one from the US government. Can you talk to us a little bit about this?
Yeah. I mean, we've been engaged with the Department of Commerce, specifically the CHIPS program now for quite a while. And we're essentially in that LOI. We're working through the closing conditions and moving that forward. But there's I would almost say there's kind of a split down. Is it important for the government to be involved or is it not? And, obviously I might be biased, but I think it has been the catalyst that has been sorely needed. And I would argue that without the government coming in and making these strategic investments and these strategic backings, the private funds would not be flowing nearly as much or nearly as quick. And so, if anything, just the government, giving nods of support has allowed the private capital markets to really jump in there because they're seeing a lot more de-risked asset base. The government has very strict and detailed due diligence processes. So it has been a fascinating experience and one that we are sure grateful for our relationship and look forward to our continued involvement with them. But one thing I want to mention is that that there's some misconceptions. A lot of folks, if you just read the headlines, it looks like the government's just willy-nilly throwing money around, the taxpayers are on the hook, and all this money's going out the door. It's much more sophisticated than that. There's very specific milestones that unlock specific aspects of the funding. And unless we and some of the other companies are hitting those milestones, those fundings don't become unlocked. So it's very structured, it's very thoughtful, and it really puts the taxpayers first as far as what's going to be at risk for them. So look, I think it's a very important time for the government to be involved. We're seeing how critical it's become with breaking our dependence on China. We've seen companies, really start to get concerned, some of them shutting down, various aspects of their manufacturing because of the lack of product they can get out of China now. So it's a catalyst that was needed, and that's certainly our take, and we're grateful for the partnership.
And for those of you out there going, hey, we need to know more about USA Rare Earth, please go to the following website. And Dr. Moyes, it has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for the update.
Thank you, Tracy. Look forward to seeing you at the CMI Summit here shortly.